Well, guys, let's go ahead and get started with our little introductions and our housekeeping. And then people will come in and probably have a great time if they come in after we're done. So I'm Tammy Moore, I'm the parent consultant at Children's Rehabilitation Service here in Homewood. I love it. And thank you for coming and joining us for our Family Connections. We're doing these monthly right now, and you'll see on the screen our parent consultants who will be hosting these. Let me let these people in. Okay, I'm multitasking. So,
Hello.
If y'all will, just mute your microphones and introduce yourself in the chat. And if you will, if you'd like to include your email, that would be great. Limit your distractions and multitasking. I'm really good at that myself. Then we can ask questions as you go. If you'll do that in chat, and then there will also be a time after, if you're not comfortable with chat, that you can ask them. We'll unmute and you can ask your question.
Hello, everybody.
Hey. Okay.
I invite guests today.
Lisa Baker is going to be our speaker for today. And she's from Sanford and is over the Department of Social Work. And she has so much vast experience with disaster preparedness. I couldn't begin to tell you all. It's just amazingly crazy. And so we're so blessed to have you, Dr. Baker. And I'm going to let you go ahead. I'm going to make you host.
Okay.
So you can share your video.
And I'm glad to. And we have hours, is that right, Tammy?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I would just ask if everybody could just kind of mute their microphones, and we're gonna, I'm gonna try to check the chat from time to time to see if there's any questions, but at the end, I'd really like to open it up for some more questions. And this is really, I'm gonna give you some information probably in about 20 minutes of just content, and then I'd really like to open it up and just get some conversation going about this. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about me, so you know where I'm coming from. So my area of research, one of my areas of research is disaster preparedness and response, particularly with families who have children with special health care needs. And this population as a whole is very, very near and dear to my heart because I am a former NICU social worker and pediatric emergency room social worker. And then I also worked for a long time at Children's Diagnostic and Treatment Center, which is down in Miami. And we just do, it's very similar to children's rehab services. We did a lot of outpatient services for families with children with special health care needs. And then as a parent, we had a child that had a significant medical diagnosis with a long inpatient stay, and then a really significant year or two of follow-up and things like that. So, so I feel like I have a little bit of a foot in both areas, but I'm so excited y'all are here today because preparedness was something that I never even knew to even think about until I was kind of called into the response area through Hurricane Katrina. So, so since then, I've really done a lot of research in this area. And I'm just so thankful that y'all are spending some time with me this morning. So I'm going to try to share my screen. This never goes really smoothly, so we'll see how it goes. It always seems to go kind of wonky, and you guys may be exposed to my very messy desktop. There it is right there. But we will get this going here. Okay, so I'm going to just go through all of the slides because it now I can't see the screen that has the chat. I'm going to go through all of my slides and then we'll open it up and I'll check the chat and we'll open it up for discussion. So when we talk about disaster, it's really any particular event that exceeds the capabilities of the response. So basically the need of the event exceeds the resources that we have to deal with it. So it's kind of like you can think of disaster on a big scale, like a hurricane or tornado, but as a parent, I can tell you there have been household disasters where the need exceeds my capability to respond. So, so I think that fits the definition too there a little bit. And we know that there are many different forms of disasters, and preparedness, when we talk about preparedness, a good preparedness plan is going to be able to address pretty much any of these. So we have the typical natural disasters, and then we also have what we categorize as man-made disasters, which are things like bombings and terrorism and things like that. Even something to keep in mind, this was a few years back, but I don't know if y'all remember the event. I think it was in Boston. I think it was around one of the bombings where they were looking for a suspect, and they literally had whole neighborhoods go on lockdown for extended periods of time. So even something like that, that's not what you typically think of, can cause you to kind of go into disaster mode. And these are some things that are, you know, very common in our area. Of course, tornadoes, hurricanes, and flooding, and then the wonderful ice storm that we had a few years back. So I think I included this slide because I think it's really important to have just a really quick overview of what response looks like. So your first responders are going to be yourself and your neighbors, right? So if something happens in your community, it's typically going to be whoever's in your household, in your neighborhood, are going to be those first responders, okay? So as I just got a little pop-up thing, so hopefully I'm letting people in as need to get in. So, you know, we typically think that it's going to be external people that are coming in to respond, but your first responders are going to be those immediately close to you. And then it goes into community response and your local response. And the federal government is actually the last tier to respond. So your response is going to start locally. So then you have to think of, okay, where is the need greater than the capacity? So if it's a very large scale disaster, it may quickly overwhelm a community, and then they have to go to the state or larger government organizations to have that happen. Let me see if I can, let's see, I've got some chat, just making sure I'm not missing anybody that needs to be let in. So, okay. Let me hop back there. There we go. Got someone in the waiting room. Let me let them in. Okay, welcome those that just joined. So the immediate needs after a disaster really revolve around communication, and I'm sorry, this is multitasking as I'm trying to let people in. They are immediate needs, which a large chunk of that is communication and information. And then you have your basic needs like your food and water and shelter, things like that. And then your long-term needs are going to be things like we saw in more in Hurricane Katrina and some of those large-scale disasters, where we have, you know, big infrastructure needs, where we have loss of livelihood with like the oil spill. And when you get into situations like that, you really get into those kind of complicated mental health needs as well, when you're dealing with loss of employment and financial needs and housing needs and things like that. So it can really be a challenge for some of those things. Some of the psychosocial needs that we see are things like, you know, just general mental health issues that can arise after a disaster or after a significant crisis. And these can include things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety. We typically always see an increase in substance use and abuse after a disaster. But you think about all of those things that really play into the emotional aspect. So you have those concerns about housing. Am I going to be able to, you know, go back to my house or stay in my house if there's been, you know, like a physical impact? Or, you know, am I going to lose my job? Am I not going to be able to work the way I need to? So things like that fall under psychosocial needs. And then we also have, you know, to consider the needs of our kids, which is why we're all here today. So we have those physical and emotional needs of children also, including, you know, disruption in school. And we've seen that over this last year, just with the pandemic. There's also a chance for disruption in medical services, which again, we've seen some of that over this last year. But if you're dealing with kind of a more typical disaster like a tornado or hurricane or things like that, you could have, you know, entire communities wiped out where you can't get to those normal services that you have. And then family stress, I think, is always there. And as families, you know, as a baseline, I think there's a significant level of stress these days. So if you think of adding a typical disaster on top of that, it gets really complicated. So we talk a lot about vulnerable populations, and, you know, this is really a very big catch-all category because the CDC defines it in basic terms based on age and disability and risk status and socioeconomic status. But we also know that there's a much broader definition. And really, when we talk about vulnerable, we talk about anybody that might need special assistance post-disaster. So that could include pregnant women, homeless people, people with transportation issues, and then all of the other issues that we think about, you know, people with communication and verbal issues, people that don't have a lot of resources, people that have medical needs, children with medical needs, all of those things. So, are there any questions right now? I can't see everybody, so questions at this point?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, I want to keep moving. Okay, so children in disasters. So children are definitely considered a vulnerable population in disasters, and they really present some special challenges. And I want you to think about your own kids and, you know, how many of these factors might come into play. So we know that, you know, kids are dependent. They are physically and emotionally dependent. So they need that adult support. Many kids are non-communicative, especially in a crisis situation. So kids that would normally be able to tell you, you know, their parents' names and their address and all of that stuff, in a crisis situation tend to, you know, shut down because of the intensity. Kids typically have increased anxiety in disasters, understandably so, are unable to provide information. And when they get separated from their caregiver, it can be extremely stressful for the child. Okay, so about 30% of patients, medical patients post-disaster, are children. And the world of disaster response, especially in pediatrics, has really advanced so much farther because it used to be a struggle because responders were still dealing with adult equipment. But now the preparedness end of that has gotten so much better. So now responders have that special equipment that is specifically for children. So we know that they require special care, they require special providers, and they are often triaged at a higher severity level than adults, which means that their injuries that they're coming in with are going to be typically on a higher level than adult injuries. There's also some determinants or kind of contributing factors that affect this. So the degree of exposure to an event means basically how close were they to something happening, okay? So if y'all can remember 9/11, I can't even remember 9/11, but, you know, there is a whole body of research just about how being closer to events like that impacts people differently. We also know that children are going to depend on their parents to let them know how they feel. So children are watching their parents all the time to see how they should be acting and how they should be responding. Okay. We also know that it's a big factor in children, and then separation again from parents is huge. So we talk about mitigating factors or things that kind of help the situation get better. And those are things like early support and early intervention. The quicker that we can get to these kids that have concerns, the better. And then obviously returning to a school scenario whenever that's possible helps to create that sense of normalcy. I'm just going to talk really quickly about reunification. So a big issue in a disaster is keeping children and families together. So we know that that is by far the best thing to do, and we need to try to do that at all costs. There are some nationwide data systems that you can go into. The Center for Missing and Exploited Children has now really expanded their system to include disasters. And then the American Red Cross, and I know you guys have seen this on social media, the Safe and Well Registry, where you can check in and basically say that you're okay or that you're still separated. So those are great tools to help that reunification process. And then also just being able to recognize and do some facial recognition to try to reunite families and children has been really big and very useful after disasters. Okay, so when we talk about children that have special healthcare needs, we're talking about 20% of households. So any child in this group is going to have equipment needs, mobility issues, medication issues, or even some developmental and behavioral issues that really pull them into that vulnerable population. And we know that parents in a crisis, and I'm going to say having been there, I fully get this, you know, we are not always the best provider of information. Most of the time we are, but in a crisis situation, that part of the brain, that kind of fight or flight can take over, and it can shut down our ability to really recall a lot of detailed information. So this is important as we go into thinking about preparedness.
Excuse me, if everyone could please mute, that would be very helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
Everyone could mute. James, that would be very helpful if you could mute.
And Tammy, are y'all hearing me okay?
Yes, wonderfully.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So when we talk about children with special healthcare needs, we know that they're a challenge for EMS, particularly if you're in an area that doesn't have easy access to a pediatric facility. And we also know that there can be a resource burden on medical needs shelters. One of the most common requests in those shelters is a med refill, and that's something that we can address in preparedness. And then also some of the other ones are loss of power in a home for children that have those power needs for equipment, and the access to basic supplies. Because if you think about the range of sizes of children, from, you know, babies to, you know, young teenagers, I mean, that's a lot of equipment that that any shelter would have to stop to be able to carry that range. So that's a significant concern. And we know that the needs are not just medical, but they're also development as well.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely get some.
Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Lisa, excuse me, you can hit mute. I'm no longer the host, so I cannot do that, but you can go and hover over the person's picture and mute.
Okay, let me see, because it's when I'm showing my slides, it doesn't show me the people. But here, I think I can, let me see if I can mute some people. Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, how's that? Okay, I think that's better. Here's
It
one.
looks like it muted from here.
Did it mute? Okay. All right, I think that's better. See how that goes. Okay. And this is popping me. Y'all have so many it's like the chat's popping up and all that stuff. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about preparedness. What we do for preparedness is we consider all hazards approach. And so all hazards means that you are preparing for anything that comes about. So like we talked about before, if you have a natural disaster or man-made disaster, if you implement these preparedness kind of activities, then chances are you're going to be prepared for the vast majority of things that come your way. And I put pandemics in there because I was kind of like, well, I don't know. The pandemics have kind of thrown things off. But I think the pandemic has really shown us areas where we are vulnerable and those gaps that we do need to fill. So in that way, I think it's been kind of useful. But typically we don't consider preparedness to be something that we need to have, for months and months and months on end. What's really interesting from the research is that we find that overall there's very low levels of preparedness with some groups that you think should be prepared. Like logically you think, okay, these groups should have a higher level of preparedness than everybody else. And those are families of children with special healthcare needs, people who have had a direct experience, so somebody who's already been in a disaster, people who are in a high risk area, like somebody that lives on the coast, or that have expressed a really high concern about a disaster. You would think all those people would be really prepared, but the research shows that they just aren't. So then you have to think, okay, well, what are those reasons? I think a really big reason is a lack of resources, and not so much daily, like resources to kind of, move about day to day, but really the ability to kind of stockpile resources just for the event of a disaster. So that can be a challenge. I think a lot of people just don't know what to do. They just don't know what they are supposed to be doing. And when they go on websites and you go to the CDC and you go to some of these places, it can seem a little overwhelming. Another big thing, which I think is true for families definitely with young children, but especially families that are also dealing with those healthcare needs, is that you've got competing priorities. I mean, sometimes, we are just trying to get through the day and make sure that we hit all the doctor's appointments we're supposed to go to, and, administer the meds and do the things we need to do to care for our children. And we don't need one more thing on the list for something that may or may not happen. I mean, we need to be realistic. There's a chance that a disaster will never hit in a catastrophic way that would require us to leave our home. But so there is that element also. And then we have a lot of just other barriers, things like, we've got pets. Like our household has 3 dogs. Lord have mercy if we have to take all 3 dogs to a shelter. That would just be chaos. There's transportation issues, especially if you're dealing with children that have special equipment. And then there's just what I call life, right? So you have your good intentions, you make your disaster kit, you got the extra batteries, and then the first time the remote goes dead, everybody's pulling batteries out of the disaster kit. Not like that happened in our household, but came very close. So the steps to personal preparedness, there's basically 3 steps, which are to get informed, make a plan, and make a kit. Okay, and then we also want to maintain the plan and go by what's considered the 3-day rule. So the 3-day rule is basically, what do you need to be prepared if you had to be totally self-sufficient for 3 days? Okay, and in this case, I think the pandemic has helped to give us that taste of what that really would look like. But the 3-day rule is kind of the approximate time that it would take for external help or external resources to be able to get to you if you were like in your house and couldn't get out. So I did a study right after the big ice storm, and I'm just going to run through this really briefly because I think you guys can really relate. So this was a study of faculty and students and staff that were on campus during the big ice storm, and their concerns, I think, are really important when you think of a communication plan. So their primary concerns were, am I going to be able to get home? Am I going to be able to get to the people that depend on me? And this could have been children or older adults. And then concerned about my own personal safety. And these were just, I'm not going to go over these, but y'all can just read through them really briefly. But, there were a lot of concerns about family and friends, concerned about other people, and then concern about health needs. Like there were, people on medications. There were people that needed daily meds that they couldn't get to. There were people that needed medications refrigerated, things like that, that all of a sudden, it was a potential crisis if they weren't able to get to those resources. This is what I think was really interesting is, we asked, do you feel, whether or not, because of this ice storm, because you had to be locked down and things like that, do you feel your preparedness level has changed because of this? And 60% said yes, but yet 90% still didn't have a communication plan, and 65% still didn't have an emergency supply kit. So we feel like there's an emotional change that happens, but not really, that's not really carried out into practice. And again, you know, those were some of the resources. Okay, so let me go back here. So when we talk about being informed, this is really what we're talking about. You need to think about what commonly happens in our area, okay? So we don't typically have big snowstorms, but we do have ice. We do have tornadoes. We typically don't have wildfires, but you need to be aware in your area of what can realistically happen. And then you also need to be aware of what are the disaster plans that are specific to your area. So you want to find out, you know, who is in charge of response, what are evacuation plans, where are shelters going to be, and more importantly, which of those shelters are going to be medical needs shelters, and also if you have pets in your home that you need to worry about too, which of those shelters are going to allow you to bring your pets. Right? And then we also want to be aware of what our community warning systems are. So we know that, you know, a lot of communities are getting away from tornado sirens and encouraging people to get like mobile apps instead to be informed. And so when you talk about making a plan, you will need to think about what information do I need in that plan? And the time to make a plan is not when the disaster is upon you. The time to make a plan is when you can sit down and think through some of these issues. So you want to, you know, meet with your family, have the family do this together, decide who your out-of-town contact is going to be, decide on a meeting place, complete a family communication plan. And this is another thing that you can do on a mobile app. You know, do you have your emergency contacts? You know, now you can add, you know, depending on your version of phone, you can add emergency health information in your phone. So think about that information that you're really going to need. And then who do you need to communicate with? You know, is it an out-of-town relative? Is it a neighbor? Is it a friend? And then also plan for those with special needs. And then, you know, again, there's a lot of resources out there to help you do this. One of them is the emergency information form, which many of you probably already have, but it's really important to have a copy of that with your plan. And then plan for pets, and then plan for different disasters. So you're going to plan for a hurricane, maybe a little bit different than you would plan for an ice storm or a flood, but you have to think through that plan and think through, okay, what happens if we need to shelter in place, meaning we can't get out of our home, or what happens if we need to be evacuated, and how are those plans going to be different? And then here's some guidelines about assembling a kit. So these are some things in a general kit that we say are recommended, and you can buy these already put together, or you can put one together, you know, as a family project or something like that. And then there's also some things that we really want that are specific to kids. So you definitely need your age-related supplies, but then also activities, any transition objects, things like that. If there are guardianship issues, you want to make sure that you have copies of those documents. Current photos of your children are really important, and then your emergency information as well. Okay. I'm going to include this a little bit because I think with the population we're working with, there's a chance that pregnancy could be an issue. So I just want to touch on just some things to do for pregnant women. So you want to complete those general preparedness guidelines, but then you also need to remember to let your healthcare provider know if you're going to be evacuated, where you're going to be. Take your prescriptions and prenatal vitamins with you, copies of your prenatal records, and then contact numbers for other providers that you may have. You want to make sure that you have all of that information before you need to evacuate. Then during a disaster, if you end up in a shelter, you want to make sure, again, that you have those prenatal records with you, that you are able to get out and walk, that you have comfortable shoes, that you have your own snacks and clothing that will fit depending on where you are in your pregnancy. And I'm going to just talk about this and give you a case example. So when I was working at Boutwell, when we were doing sheltering, we had a bunch of evacuees from New Orleans. It wasn't Katrina, it was the hurricane after that, and I'm blanking on it. But we had a woman who had a very high risk pregnancy the first time around. She was pregnant with her second child, and she was actually scheduled for a C-section the day she was evacuated from New Orleans. She did not have any medical records with her at all. So when she went to the shelter and told them that, she went to UAB, and because there were no records, she couldn't adequately communicate the risks that she had. So they sent her back to the shelter. So as the social worker working with her, it was really challenging because we couldn't get any information from her provider down in New Orleans, and it was just kind of a mess for a few days. So, so it's really, really important to have those records with you. If you're evacuated, you know, try to eat throughout the day, bring bottled water if you can, just to make sure that your water you're drinking is clean. Try to reduce your stress as much as possible, easier said than done. And then be sure that you recognize symptoms of early labor. And then these are some potential post-disaster issues that you could face as well. So I'm just gonna skim through those. And we are flying through this. I'm flying through the time, so I'm gonna try to speed up a little bit here. Okay, children and disasters. If you can, it is really fun to get your kids involved in disaster planning. We did it in our family. We've done it with a bunch of Girl Scout troops, with the kids, and it not only makes the child feel like a tremendous part of the family, but it also reduces their anxiety because they have a plan in their mind. And remember, with kids, what children think about in their mind is typically worse than what reality is. Okay, so they jump to places we can't even go in our mind. But so when you involve them in that, you kind of normalize it and say, okay, if this happens, this is what our plan, and this is what we're going to do. You want to plan for those special needs, and it's going to be different for every family. Review the communication plan multiple times. Make sure everybody is on board. Ensure that your cell phone has emergency contact information. Register for emergency services with your utility companies, and then make sure that in your household you have those things that you need in case you have to shelter, that we know are now our high safety items. So things like bike helmets if you have to shelter for a tornado. Shoes is a big one. It seems like disasters typically happen in the middle of the night and everybody's running around in their pajamas. So make sure if you have advance notice that something could be coming up, make sure that you have tennis shoes available that you can pull into your safe area and put on. So if there is damage outside, you're not walking around with bare feet. During and after a disaster, you want to implement the plan and then, be aware of those dangers, but also do whatever you can do to kind of restore your routine as soon as possible. You want to recognize signs of stress in the kids and allow your kids to help in those recovery efforts, because it really does give them a sense of purpose and reduce the anxiety. And then always, 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 and I'm just going to say this is an important life lesson, y'all really need to monitor the information and the way that information is being presented. I remember working at the shelter after Hurricane Katrina, and they had the news stations were streaming 24/7 on the Jumbotron, and it was too much. It was just information overload, and the people could not disconnect and get a mental break. So it was really a challenge. Okay, so I promised that I would talk about tiered preparedness, and it's kind of like, what can you do if you can just do the minimum, and then what's a little bit better, and then what's the best that you can do. So I'm going to say for this population, the basic thing that you guys need to do is you need to be aware of what's going to could potentially be in your area. You need to have a plan for transportation, have a plan for loss of power, at least have a 24-hour supply of food and water and any supplies that you need, and then a medical summary with a prescription list. I'm going to say that's the minimum. And then if you want to go a step further, make sure you know where those special needs shelters are. Write out your communication plan. have a copy of your written health summary, and then have extra supply of medications and a 3-day supply of food and water and supplies. And then go ahead, since we're dealing with kids, make sure you have those comfort items as well. And then the best thing, you know, if you kind of want to think of the gold standard, that's when you're really going to be thinking about having hard copies of all of that paperwork, making sure it's in a safe that's fireproof and waterproof. Have a communication plan that has some redundancy, meaning that you have more than one person to call, or you have more than one plan in place. You have an A plan and a B plan, and that everybody is on board. But I realize that when you look at preparedness, it can seem really overwhelming and a lot, but go through your mind and think, what are the most important things for you and your family? And what would you most need in a disaster? And I would start there. And these are some resources, you know, Alabama Power, definitely your pediatrician, you can discuss it with your pediatrician. Most pediatricians in this area are very attuned to pediatric preparedness. Your social worker, your caseworker, even your neighbors or your friends and other family members. And then there's a lot of really great online resources as well. So the CDC has a great webpage about children with special healthcare needs. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics has a ton of information on disasters in children. And it talks about, there's some great information about the pandemic, but it talks about evacuation, it talks about post-disaster, and it talks about preparedness as well.
And thank you, Dr. Baker, again so much. We appreciate
Thank you all
it.
so much. Thank you for everything you're doing just for every family, and that y'all are doing for your kids, and you guys are in the trenches. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Thank you.